Welcome in. Good to have you. Big news for Florida State today. It looks like the Noles are going to hire Nebraska defensive coordinator, associate head coach Tony White to join the staff. And joining me to talk about that, HuskerOnline, Sean Callahan, good buddy of mine and a guy that we've done some work together, and I needed your expertise here, my friend. Tony White, a guy you're very familiar with, obviously covering this program better than anybody else in the business. The numbers say he's done a very, very good job. We were talking off the air. Seems to me this might be a little disappointing for Nebraska fans to learn this. I think for Florida State fans, it's an exciting hire. Your thoughts on Tony White?
Yeah, just on the surface for Nebraska, it is a tough blow. I mean, you think about a month ago, Tony White and Marcus Satterfield were their two coordinators. Well, Matt Rule took Marcus Satterfield out of play calling duties after the UCLA game, the loss to the Bruins. And then he brought in Dana Holgerson from the outside. Well, during that same week, he also brought Phil Snow to campus, who had been consulting Nebraska's defense, but to work with the defense. And I felt like from that point on, a lot had changed just with how things were going with him and the coordinators. And then, they finished out the year. They got a great win against Wisconsin. The defense played really well against Iowa, but came up short. They still only held Iowa to 5 first downs and no third down conversions, but lost 13-10 in Iowa City. This stings. I mean, you think about Tony White at his peak, his best games this year were against some of the best competition. He put Colorado or held Colorado to their worst game of the year. I mean, he minimized Travis Hunter. I don't think Travis Hunter had an explosive play against Nebraska's defense, and the Buffaloes had no running game to speak of. Shedeur Sanders was on his back a lot of that game. The Ohio State game was another game where Nebraska's defense completely stifled the Buckeyes. I mean, they had no answer for what Nebraska was doing. The Buckeyes converted just 1 third down. It was a QB sneak where there was actually a false start not called on Ohio State. So that was another dominating game that we saw this year. And then the Iowa game on Friday. So that was tough. But then on the flip side, there were some bad moments, some inconsistent moments. You go to the UCLA game, it started out, UCLA's offense was on the field for 27 plays compared to 3 for Nebraska. They opened that game with 14 and 13 play drives to jump up on the Huskers. The Indiana game was a 56-7 loss where things really unraveled, and Nebraska's defense was not really able to force a punt the entire game. So there were moments like that, too, that were really hard to put your finger on, where how could you play so well against Colorado and Ohio State, but then have a game like that against Indiana?
Sean, would you say that, I guess if we're looking, everybody always wants to get a general sense of what a coach's strengths are, or weaknesses for that matter. It seems to me, just by perusing the stats everywhere he's been, whether it was Arizona State or Syracuse briefly and then Nebraska, his defenses has, generally speaking, done a very good job against the run. Is that an accurate assessment of who he is and seems to emphasize?
Yeah, from the get-go, that was the case. Go back to his very first game at Nebraska against Minnesota. He forced P.J. Fleck to pass the ball more than he had ever passed in a game in his entire time at Minnesota, because they couldn't run on Nebraska. And, there were a lot of critics of the 3-3-5. Can it stop the run? Well, he immediately in week 1 of the 2023 season, put a scheme together where the Gophers had no answer. Now, I do think teams in this conference did adjust, though. They made adjustments to Nebraska, and you saw Nebraska have to make some adjustments back. They did a really good job, for example, against Kyle Monungai from Rutgers. They held him to under 100 yards. They held Caleb Johnson to under 100 yards. They adjusted the 3-3-5, and they would go with more of a heavier front on defense, where you would see them sub out a linebacker and maybe put an extra defensive line body and play more traditional 4-man front. So it is a versatile scheme. It is not just exclusively 3-down linemen. And I think that was what made it hard at times for teams playing Nebraska, because you didn't really know what it was going to look like and where the pressure at times was going to come from with what they did on defense.
That's the next question I was going to ask you, and you helped inform me without me having to ask, is how multiple is it? Sounds like he's willing to adjust accordingly, obviously. Tony White, the man, the guy that you've seen in practices or opportunities to see coach, what's he like? Obviously, most people like to think of their defensive coordinator. I know he's, 45 years old, married, a couple kids. A lot of people think of their defensive coordinators hard-nosed. Obviously, if he's stopping the run, seems to be fairly intense. You can tell me, demeanor-wise, just what are Florida State fans going to see from Tony White on game days?
Yeah, he's a true leader of men. I mean, when you're around him, I mean, he commands respect, and you know, a lot of people believed he was on the track to be a head coach. A year ago, he was up for multiple head coach jobs. You know, the San Diego State job, I think, was one that he could have maybe gotten last year. Syracuse opened. I mean, he had just left Syracuse. He was mentioned there, but the big one was UCLA. He had been the former, you know, played for the Bruins, and Deshaun Foster got that job. But, you know, I think a lot of people thought he was the runner-up, and because of the transfer portal and players leaving a school, I think UCLA played it safe. They didn't want to have 40 or 50 guys enter the portal, and but a lot of people thought he could get that UCLA job last year. USC also talked to him about being their defensive coordinator last year and went with somebody else, or it didn't work out. And, you know, he was one of the highest paid coordinators in the Big Ten Conference, so that he was well compensated here. I would expect Florida State is going to pay him north of $2 million. I believe he was making 1.9 at Nebraska, and it would not surprise me if he pushed 2.3 to 2.5 at Florida State to get him, obviously, to leave a place like Nebraska.
Who is he as a recruiter, Sean? Tony White, I'm learning about him on the fly, at least in the sense of digging deeper, right? I mean, I know who he was. People know Nebraska's defense is very good. I'm just kind of curious as to who he is as a recruiter.
Well, he grew up in El Paso, Texas, and he played his college ball in L.A., so he's pretty versatile. Everybody loves him. He's really good with families and kids. You know, I think and I think he's recently recruited Florida. And, you know, there's a couple other things to watch here and angles tied to Florida State already. Phil Simpson, I'm not sure you're familiar with him, but he is an analyst on the Florida State staff. He worked with White at Nebraska last year. He's the former Miami Homestead head coach, state championship head coach there. He brought a lot of Florida players to Nebraska. So this is another angle to watch with Phil Simpson, who brought all that talent, then left for Tallahassee. Now with Tony White coming to Florida State, there's some smoke as well, Jeff, about possibly defensive line coach Terrence Knighton, who played in the NFL, is a big personality. Players love him. That's another name that could end up coming to Tallahassee. I think you want to watch that, but there is already a natural tie in the building in Tallahassee, and that would be Phil Simpson, the former Miami Homestead head coach who worked with White in 2023.
Awesome information, Sean. I'll talk to you again here in the coming days, I'm sure. Always do a great job with Husker Online. Thanks for taking the time for us this morning, getting this out there. Learned a lot in a brief period of time. Appreciate you, brother.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Take care. Sean Callahan, Husker Online, for all your Nebraska stuff. Good stuff there. Exciting news for Florida State, especially as it pertains to recruiting and some connections to the state of Florida as well. More on the Jeff Cameron Show, more on Warchant. Follow along. We'll be updating you constantly throughout this week as names begin to trickle in for Florida State as the new staff is put together.